Good morning, everyone. This is Suveda from Zephyr Lake Carmelite Mission. Today, I would like to continue Ascent upon Carmel by John of the Cross, Book 3, chapters 33 to 36. And before I begin, I'd like to just say a prayer for peace in this world. And peace begins and originates from God Himself, the Holy Trinity who resides within us. So when we focus on prayer, the peace of God permeates our intellect, our memory, and our will, and it manifests itself in our exterior behaviors, the way we think, act, and treat each other. So we pray for our own individual transformation and conversion so that we will be peaceful people who live in harmony with each other, and let that peace then permeate this whole universe. And that is the beauty of the humankind, that God has given us this ability to bring about this peace that He gives us individually into this world through prayer and through our words, our actions, and our behaviors. And continuing with John of the Cross, we were discussing about joy and how joy influences the will, and how we need to take care to avoid certain objects or certain things so that we can love God for the sake of Him and not because of all these goods and things that we experience and receive from God, and naturally, and both supernaturally and in a natural and temporal sense. So we were talking about temporal, natural, sensory, moral, supernatural, and today we are going to talk about the spiritual goods, the nature and the kind of joy that arises in the will based on spiritual goods that we receive and experience. So in chapter 33, he kind of gives an overview of what he's going to talk about on the benefits and harms of avoiding spiritual goods, even spiritual goods. And then in chapter 34 onwards, he actually speaks of, how to conduct ourselves, so that our will is not controlled by the joys that arise from these spiritual goods. The nature and division of the sixth kind of good that is a possible object of our joy in the will is spiritual goods. When soul acquires sensory satisfaction from spiritual goods, a good part of what was destined for the spirit is spoiled. It's like drinking up water before they reach the spirit, leaves the spirit empty and dry. So we have to savor and allow the spiritual good to actually make a spiritual and influence in our soul, in our spirit, and not just be having the spiritual good itself satisfy our sensory, our sensory aspect of us. So then the spirit doesn't derive any moral good, any good from it. And he says, an aid and motivating force in turning the soul to divine things and communion with God. Instead of focusing on the spiritual good, we focus on communion with God. Helps God's communication to the soul to be more receptive. So God's communication is there, but the soul becomes more receptive to it when we focus on God and communion and with God and on divine things instead of the sensory joys that the spiritual goods bring. And then he basically divides this into two broad categories. So we experience from spiritual goods delightful, distinctly understood like knowledge in the intellect, emotions in the will, and imagination in the memory. And also you have the painful. So there's the delightful and the painful, And then you have within each of the delightful and the painful, either clearly understood distinct experiences or knowledge, or you can have vague and obscure experiences. So what is he talking about? For example, for the delightful and vague or not distinctly understood experiences could be the contemplation, that we experience, the union of the soul with God. It's delightful, and it is, but it's unclear, it's vague, it's obscure. It's just a knowledge that God is present, and there is this peace, but there is no clear understanding. So that is an example of a delightful. The painful also has a clear, distinct, like sufferings that we may experience that God will permit in order for us to go through the passive night, the purgation. And then you have the vague and obscure kind of painful experience or experiences that is like the dark night of the soul, where the soul is going through a passive night where even its interior senses has no consolations, but the soul is truly being purged and being more close to God than it has ever been before. And that is the vague and obscure dark night that the soul experiences, that is painful. But in this upcoming chapters, he's not going to speak of either the union of the soul with God or the dark night or the focus on painful, clear and distinct experiences. What he's focusing on and talking about in this context is the distinctly understood, delightful experiences that we derive from spiritual goods. So that's what he's covering in the upcoming chapters. Okay, so this is what he discusses. And then he divides the spiritual goods also according to the faculties of the soul. So the spiritual goods can bring about knowledge in the intellect, emotions in the will, and imagination in the memory. Again, like I said before, the painful goods, he's not going to discuss. That belongs to the passive night. It's the vague and indistinct, delightful goods that belong to the general, vague, loving knowledge in union with God. He's not going to discuss that either. So chapter 34, he's talking about the proper conduct of the will as to joy in the distinct spiritual goods, delightful, distinct spiritual goods communicable to the intellect and memory. The will should be emptied of this joy in these kinds of apprehensions of the intellect and memory, just like how he discussed in book 2, in the earlier part of this Ascent of Mount Carmel, that he discussed that the soul must direct everything to God. Its joy included in that category. It should be directed towards God and not the spiritual good itself, in order to be safe from any of the harms and deceptions that were discussed in book 2. So the will should be emptied of joy in these apprehensions of the intellect and memory. The same is required of the intellect and memory, that they are directed by the will to God in all these joys. And delightful spiritual goods also, he divides it into 4 kinds. There are 4 kinds of spiritual goods that he speaks of that give distinct joy to the will. Provocative, directive, motivating, and perfective. So as an example, motivating. Examples of that is statues, paintings of saints, visiting oratories, ceremonies. All of those things are motivating us to raise our mind and heart to God, towards God. But they themselves shouldn't be the object of our delight, but it should be God who should be the object of our delight. So vain joy in above things, which is statues, paintings, even though they are vital for divine worship and are necessary to move the will to devotion, it is vain to rejoice more in the painting and ornamentation than in the object represented by them. And he gives some principal reasons that the church uses divine images in worship is that reverence given to the saints, or through them, reverence is given to the saints that they represent. And the second principal reason is to motivate the will and awaken a devotion to the saints by the means of these divine objects and images. It does not serve the purpose if one is more focused on artistry and ornamentation that satisfy the senses and delights it. This is an obstacle to authentic spirituality, which requires annihilation of affections in all particular things. So adoring statues with clothing and jewelry is kind of a vanity and a practice which hinders authentic and sincere devotion of the soul. I mean, those should be done with focus, not on the artistry, not on the jewelry, not on the garments or the ornamentation, but the focus should be on divine things, on God and the things represented by them. And he gives some quotations from the Old Testament where God himself advises us to not be too vain with these practices, because then they become a hindrance. Truly devout people direct their devotion to the object represented. They have little need for images. They seek the living image of Christ crucified within themselves. They are unaffected when these motivating images are taken away, and they remain calm. People are more perfect when they remain tranquil and calm in privation of these motivating, holy, and spiritual objects and images. And he further says there is no perfection in being so attached to even these devotional things. So these are hard things for spiritual people because we are very attached to our icons and statues and rosaries, and he's saying we need to purge ourselves actively even of those attachments. The more we are attached with a possessive spirit to the image, the less will be their prayer and devotion that will raise to God himself. These means should be an aid in one's flight to God and not become a hindrance through imperfection arising from attachment and possessiveness. Spiritual poverty is demanded for perfection. Rosary's design does not have any influence on God. It is a prayer that has an effect. God hears the prayers of the simple and pure heart that is only concerned about pleasing God and does not bother about the kind of rosary used except in regard to the indulgences associated with the rosary that has been given by the ecclesiastical authorities. Our vain covetousness clings to everything. Choosing ornate rosaries and statues is vain, for it is the instrument that brings joy to the senses. If we were only concerned with the love of God, we would be indifferent to the kind of rosary, the kind of statue, its style and craftsmanship, and the ornamentality. These attachments and possessive spirit in religious articles is the same we have in other temporal furnishings. The harm from such attitude, he says, is very serious. So there we have more conversion, more transformation necessary. And then in chapter 36, he continues with the discussion of images and the ignorance of some in their use of them. The favors God bestows is based on the devotion of the individuals and not because images and those statues. It's not the images and the statues, but the devotion and the sincerity of the person's devotion. These images and statues are a means to produce the effect of devotion in people. God only looks at faith and the purity of the prayerful heart. The statues should not be held in higher esteem because God works miracles and grants favors by means of them, for they are only an instrument to enkindle devotion and prolong prayer. Example, if you had equal devotion to Our Lady before two different images or no image, God would still grant the same favors. Sometimes God even grants greater favors through poorly represented images, so we will not attribute these favors to the images itself but to God. God grants favors through images in remote and solitary places often because the journey and the effort that a person or persons make, it makes the person's affection for God increase and their prayer more intense to go through that arduous journey to that remote and solitary place to visit that particular image through which God grants those special favors. And pilgrimages is an example made alone in an unusual time among lots of difficulties, rather in a large crowd for recreation and entertainment, is far more worthier. Where there is faith and devotion, any image will be sufficient. Jesus, the living image, was rejected by many who walked with him. Certain images may have a special influence on souls and remain fixed in mind as though they were present. And recalling this particular image will produce in that person the special spiritual influence that other images may not produce, and that's okay because it's what devotion it produces. Some people have more devotion for a particular workmanship than others. It could be a natural liking and a natural attachment. And sometimes people see images move or speak or make a sign. They might hear some words or some instructions or some gestures. God allows this to increase devotion in the person experiencing that. But the supernatural effects, even if authentic, good, and from God, and not a deception of the devil, must not be desired, but be avoided to preserve oneself from harm and deception. So that's how St. John of the Cross says that we are to purge our souls even of these desires for these spiritual goods and to desire and seek God alone. So directing our will to God and only making use of all these things that God has given to us in this life as a means, but the end is God, and it's a means to increase devotion, to intensify our prayers, to help us, but they are not an end in themselves. So that's what St. John of the Cross is trying to get us to detach ourselves from these even spiritual goods that bring delight to the and joy to the will. So with that, I'd like to conclude today's session on St. John of the Cross as Ascent of Mount Carmel. We are coming very close towards the end of this book of his. There's a few more chapters left. And I'm thinking that my next series might be on the dark night of the soul. But I'm not fully decided on that yet. But I think that will be the logical next book to cover in my series. So thank you, and for those who are celebrating Thanksgiving tomorrow, I want to wish a happy Thanksgiving to the people in the United States especially, and also for those who don't celebrate Thanksgiving but celebrate the Heritage Day, celebrating the heritage of the Native Americans in our country and all over the continents, especially in the Americas. On Friday is the Heritage Day. So I'd like to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving, a happy Heritage Day, and let us pray for peace on earth, and let's trust in the merciful love of God that envelops this world, and it's always available to us, no matter how poorly human beings behave in inhumane ways and violent ways in war and conflict. But God's love is always faithful to us. It's never changing. He's always merciful to us, always reaching out to us. He never rejects anyone who comes to him. He loves us no matter what we do. He loves us, and he's waiting for us to come back to him with a conversion of heart, with peaceful hearts, hearts free from violence and conflict. So happy Thanksgiving and happy Heritage Day, and may God bless all of you.